Chapter 15 The Weather Makers. A New Bride on the Horizon. For some time, threatening masses of cloud had been massing in the west, and one sultry afternoon a mighty torrent of rain poured down. Old and young cupped their hands and caught the water which poured in at the entrance to the hut, and rubbed it into their bodies. The Indians called on me to do the same. "It will make us better hunters. You too will shoot more apes," they maintained. The little boys and girls ran about on the open space outside with shouts of glee, and refreshed their naked limbs in the welcome shower bath. Only one man did not seem pleased to see the rain. This was the chief, Vito. With an anxious expression he watched all that was going on. He was thinking of his clearing, where rain at this season of the year would cause irreparable damage. If the wet weather continued, then the dry leaves and brushwood would rot and be of no use in the forthcoming burning down of the wood. Moreover, the rain caused the roots and stems of the felled bushes to sprout again. Weeds would shoot up before the field could be sown, and instead of a tidily burnt and cleared patch, a wilderness would arise, which even with the greatest efforts could scarcely be cleared again. This threatening disaster had to be staved off, and Vito announced a ceremony with which he proposed to drive off the rain for a good while. A few days later, Ube, the son of the second magician, Quayo, ground the necessary quantities of snuff, and as the weather was cool, the men decided to hold the meeting outside on the clearing in front of the Maloka. They intimated to me that I was to stay in the hut, and blocked up the entrance with mats and palm leaves, for during a magic ceremony no one was allowed to pass in or out. Even a dog or a chicken which ran into the circle of magicians was enough to endanger the whole success of the ceremony. I did not trouble to make any further efforts to be allowed to take part in the ritual. I could not sit in the sun for hours, for I had learned by experience that that was the best way to stir up my latent malaria. So I sat down with the women in the darkened hut, and watched them busily stripping the leaves of corn cobs, and removing the seeds, in order to brew a few jars of fresh chicha. Now and then they made some remark on the sounds which came in from the clearing outside, but for the time being there was nothing particular to hear. Then suddenly there rang out a rhythmic hand-clapping and a monotonous recitation in high voices. This was something new to me. I jumped up to peer through a chink in the doorway, but the women held me back in alarm. "Don't go near, you'll die on the spot," they implored me anxiously. The ceremony lasted for several hours. It was not until the afternoon that the magicians removed the covering from the doorway, and returned warily into the hut. "It will not rain again before the maize crop," Vito informed me confidently. If the power of the magicians was as great as they themselves believed, then we had about 2 more months of good weather to expect. After he had bathed, Vito invited me hospitably to his corner of the hut. "Come and eat some ground nuts," he said. This had scarcely ever happened before. Usually he had brought the jar to my hammock, or sent Conquad with it unless we had, in any case, been eating together outside the hut. I sat down with his family, and while I munched a juicy arm of an ape, I noticed among the womenfolk a cross-eyed, well-built young woman. I had often been struck by the vigorous part she took in all the work on Vito's field, and in the hut as well. I asked Vito her name and who her husband was, expecting a dubious look and an evasive answer, as was always the case when I asked the Indians about a woman, however innocent the question. But this time the chief was not at all angry about my curiosity. Indeed, he seemed pleased at the interest I was showing, and willingly told me the story of the young woman. "That is Tonga, my cousin," he began. "People also call her Abe, that is, the dumb one, for when she was quite a big girl, she could still not speak properly. Her father, mother, and brothers are all dead. When she was still small, Kwarume took her as his wife. At that time, Kwarume had 4 wives. Tonga did a lot of work, and Kwarume was very fond of her, but she has not had a child by him. Kwarume is a very wild, hot-tempered man. When we drink chicha, he does not sing and dance with us, but falls into a frenzy and wants to kill people. Once, when he was drunk, he shot at Tonga. The arrow struck her in the hip, but the wound soon healed up. At another drinking feast, Kwarume again flew into a rage and shot at Tonga, but she saw him taking aim and quickly turned to one side, and so the arrow did not pierce her heart. It went through her right arm and right breast, and the point came out between her breasts. It went on as far as this. Here the chief demonstrated with both hands how deep the arrow had penetrated the young woman's breast into her left breast. Then he took another mouthful of the boiled ground nuts and maize and went on. Tonga fell unconscious to the ground, and the ground was covered for far around with blood. The people drew out the arrow and thought that she was dead, but at sunset she came around. For many days she lay in her hammock, neither eating nor speaking. When she was able to walk again, she ran away from Kwarume and came to my Maloka, for she is my cousin. Now she has her hammock here and works with my women. Kwarume keeps on trying to get her back, but she is afraid of him and no longer wants to be his wife. Now she has no husband." Vito concluded in a plaintive, almost tearful voice, which was in sharp contrast with his vigorous, manly nature, and conveyed to me, in no uncertain terms, what a sad plight a young woman is in when she has no husband. Tonga had followed Vito's narrative with keen interest. Now she came up to me and bent down towards me. "Itoa, look at that," she lamented, and touched her arm and breast, where the entry and exit of the arrow had left plain marks. A swarm of curious children stood round us. Suddenly, Iad's little son, with an expectant expression, asked me, Otsi ne Tongon? Would I not take Tonga as my wife?" Kamatsuka, the determined wife of the chief, looked at me in eager expectation. Then she pronounced her verdict. "Tonga has no husband, and you have no wife. Tonga is a good wife for you." There I tried to read in Vito's face whether it was meant seriously, but his expression was unmoved. Tonga was still standing in front of me. She smiled nervously, and it was not easy to read her thoughts in her squinting eyes. Suddenly, something dawned in my memory. Had it not been this woman who had often passed close to my hammock on her way to fetch water, and whispered every time "Umen" to me. Now "Umen" means my husband, and doubtless the young woman had for a long time been delicately trying to give me a hint of her status as a separated woman, and declare that she was prepared to receive my addresses. However, I was not left much time to speculate on possible married bliss with Tonga, for Kamatsuka was plucking me by the sleeve. "Take off your shirt," she commanded, with maternal authority. She had meanwhile been chewing green juniper fruit and spitting the juice into a bowl. With it she painted the usual stripes on the chest, back, arms, and face, first on me and then on the whole family. It was the eve of a fresh 3-day carousal, which was once again to be celebrated with women's chicha. Eod, the chief's brother, gave this party to the women in recognition of their help in his large fields. Men work and have their own chicha. Women work too and shall also have their own feast. Such was the logic of these savages, and I was astonished to find so progressive an institution in the jungle, for not even the emancipated white women of Europe and America, with their tea and coffee parties and social occasions, have much more to show. When the sun went down and night came on, the concert began. Men and boys walked up and down outside the hut, playing as they did so the old TUPARI melodies on their bamboo flutes. True, one or another of the musicians would lie down for a nap, but most of them were tireless, and made the woods and our huts remote dwellings in this infinite wilderness ring with their notes and wild cries until day was dawning, and the women proffered the tired dancers a copious, well-deserved morning drink. morning drink. Vito was not altogether pleased with me. "You're like an old grandfather, lying in your hammock all night." Reproachfully he looked at me out of heavy eyes. "I, Vito, have been making music and dancing all this time." All day long the women left the exhausted men in peace. The Indians have an astonishing number of rules and etiquette, but there is none which forbids shaking a weary sleeper into wakefulness as many times as one likes if one has a bowl of chicha to offer him. The 3 wives of Eod, the host, were the only women of whom there was no trace. They had run off to their mother in the next hut, so it was said, for Eod had beaten them the day before and threatened to shoot them. But there were enough women left to serve up the strong yucca beer. Small wonder that Vito was lying dead drunk and snoring loudly on a pile of wood near the entrance to the hut that evening. No one was offended at seeing the chief and dreaded head magician in this condition. This was only natural, for anyone who did not get drunk at such a feast must have something wrong with him. But tonight even the other men and boys seemed played out. Yesterday they had danced all day. Today they had drunk the whole time. Now they left the jars of chicha and the dance floor in the undisputed possession of the festive women, in whose honor the celebration was being held. The women, just like their husbands, had also chosen for their place of assembly the main entrance where my hammock was slung. There they drank and chatted merrily away. Sleep was out of the question, and I raised no objection when Tonga, the chief's cross-eyed cousin, brought me a calabash full of chicha, and then drew me from my hammock to dance. For the first few circuits she led me by the hand, but soon she placed my arm round her neck and clasped me caressingly round the hips. The TUPARI never danced in couples. However, it did not seem to excite their interest that we went round in their dance, thus clasped together. We danced and sang and drank. The cross-eyed girl nestled ever more affectionately against me, and it was not long before she drew me unobtrusively into the darkness, and began whispering to me, "I won't have anything to do with Kwarume. He is no longer my husband," and as if to emphasize it, she tapped the scars on her breast. "I am your wife, and you are my husband," she next told me in a decided manner. Then she cautiously tried to elicit whether I had not already a wife and children somewhere. In eager whispers she talked of this and that, and asked me much that I only half understood, if at all. Then 2 girls appeared, looked in astonishment, and offered us their half-filled chicha bowls. We emptied them and went off to dance again. When tired of trotting round, I lay down in my hammock. The women at last took pity on me and did not wake me again. I slept until long after it was light, but the enthusiastic singers were still dancing, and scarcely had they seen that I had opened my eyes. Then they were bringing me more to drink, and trying to drag me off to the dance once more. Thus began the second day of revelry and drinking, and when I took out my diary, I noticed that it was the 1st of August, our national day of celebration in Switzerland. The women who had been dancing all night looked curiously over my shoulder to see how I wielded my pen. They had no idea of the purpose of writing, and thought that I was doing it just for the fun of the thing. But they also wanted to try their skill. Up and down they moved the pen holder and filled the page after page with zigzag lines. But scribbling did not appear to give them any special pleasure, so they thought out other things to do, as an outlet for their energies. They dressed up as Hamno. These were the bloodthirsty headhunters, the traditional deadly enemies of the tribe. Round their hips, arms, and head they hung huge bundles of straw until they felt themselves to be completely unrecognizable. Then they rushed upon the men with bow and arrow and the long espadas, brandished their weapons in their faces, and raised a shout of which one would hardly have believed these respectable women capable. The men could not let it rest there. They also dressed themselves up, armed themselves for defense, and it was not long before the 2 mobs charged at each other with a violence enough to make one think that the innocent game was a real war between the sexes. Those who were not taking part looked on with lively interest, shouting at the tops of their voices to urge on the 2 sides, and clasping their stomachs with delight. In the evening I was to dance once more, in the shade of a chicha mortar. Adaid was crouching, and she grasped me by the trouser leg. "Come out on to the path," she whispered. the young daughter of my neighbor Uruai, watched us closely, her little face showing concern. Night had already fallen, so I pretended to have heard nothing and danced on with the circling crowd. In front, the leaders of the chorus were stamping with shouldered espadas or holding bow and arrow. Ki uapa, kiduat, kahara, tepoba, we will drink chicha and not be afraid, they sang. They were joined by the men and boys, and finally, in rows of 2 or 3, just as they came, followed the women and the crowd of girls. Today the boys had taken possession of me. Some clasped me round the shoulders, others tugged me by the hand, and the smallest hung to my belt, and did not seem to want to let me go. When Adade and Niakab bore down upon me, the young women thrust the resisting youngsters energetically aside, took me between them, and giggled proudly over their capture. They had been partaking freely of chicha, and during every pause Adade drew me to a jar which was standing in the darkness, and pressed me to drink. If the resin torch went out for a moment, or if there happened to be no one near, she stroked me tenderly and drew my hands hungrily over her young limbs. Once again the singing started up, and we danced in the circle of the tribesmen, and once again the little flame went out. The whole company stood still in order not to stumble over the fragile chicha jars in the darkness. Then I felt 2 arms clasped tightly round my neck. The naked body of a girl hung to me and drew me powerfully down to her. By Indian standards, this was something unheard of. Only Adade could be capable of such a thing. Before I could recover from my surprise, the light flared up again. There were indignant exclamations from those standing nearest us, and everyone turned toward us as if electrified. With a low cry, Adade let me go and vanished into the darkness. I was standing in the circle of Indians like some condemned criminal. They measured me with disapproving glances, and murmured in embarrassment. The company, which a moment ago had been singing and dancing, so happily broke up in confusion as if something terrible had happened, and I fully expected the wronged husband Iad to come rushing out of the darkness to shoot his fickle wife and me, or to kill us with a heavy espada. Seldom had I felt so uneasy as I did that night. The hut seemed desolate. I crept into my hammock. This was indeed a strange way to celebrate August 1st, and I was far from certain whether it might not be my last on earth. The silly girl had behaved in a quite unseemly way in full view of everyone, young and old. Might not Iad hold me responsible for the evil tendencies of his wife, and consider that one of us was superfluous in this world? With the great respect which I had for the arrows of jealous Indians, I thought with apprehension of the moment when news of the scandal was given to the husband lying drunk in his hammock. It was not until nearly morning that I fell into an uneasy sleep. A murmuring near me made me wake again soon after. In the main passage-way sat a crowd of men, engaged in serious conversation. Round about stood the boys, listening attentively. The Indians seemed deeply stirred. Again and again the word Tarupa, the stranger, was uttered, and again the name of Adade was uttered by the men with rage and loathing. There could be no possible doubt. Even while I had been sleeping, the TUPARI had met together to discuss the events of last night. The dominant figure in the council was Vito. He was at the same time the chief and the brother of the injured husband. Darkly, very darkly, he looked, nor did he come to bid me good morning. The boys looked across to me with faint, enigmatic smiles. I lay motionless in my hammock, as if I feared that any movement of mine might hasten the course of some dire impending doom, and, for the rest, did what all accused men have to do, innocent or guilty. I awaited the verdict of my judges, and all I could hope was that both of us, the silly young woman and myself, would get away unscathed. The men spoke solemnly, one after the other, some more violently, some more placidly, according to their temperaments. Then at last the tension seemed to dissolve. The boys looked rather more hopeful, and to my great surprise and relief, the chief's wife, Kamatsuka, came and brought me a gourd full of chicha. She was followed by the chief, who also brought me a drink, and then the injured Iod came too. Aki, bravo, now, I am not angry with you, he said solemnly, and handed me his bowl. I still feared that the chicha might be poisoned, but all I could do was to drink it up. Not satisfied with that, Iod brought me a lavish breakfast of poultry and boiled tubers. I was hungry and did the meal full justice, and when even then I felt no pains in my stomach, I at last believed that this time I had escaped unhurt. But what had happened to Adaid? I could not see her anywhere, nor did I dare to inquire about her. Only days afterwards did I discover her in the other hut, and learned that Iod had given the woman back to her mother. Adaid was free then, and had accomplished what she seemed to have been trying for a long time, and what I had wanted to help her do. The awkward part which I had played in the matter, and the fright which I had had over the stupid girl, I could well have done without. Besides, the vision of myself as a heroic fighter for the rights of a poor orphan seemed more and more dubious, and, to judge by everything which the tribesmen told me, I began to wonder whether Adaid was not simply a loose woman, who perhaps not only had not got on well with Iod, but who did not wish to become a proper married woman at all. Chapter 16. The Story of a Murder, and Vito tells of the Tarupa. I had really had more than enough of the hard work in the clearings, but after the happenings of the night before last, and the painful court proceedings, I was glad to give a hand again. My arm was at last better, and for days Pakuja had been urging me to help on his plantation. In accordance with custom, he had spent several days clearing the first strip on his own. Now we spread out in a long row to continue the work which had been begun. Pakuja himself was not working today. He supervised his relatives and friends who were chopping down the undergrowth. Soon he took me away from the work. We sat down on a felled tree, and with little preamble Pakuja revealed a story, the telling of which was obviously a matter of great concern to him. Vito, the chief, is a very wicked man, he began. He shot the father of Tamareka, Ajiro, and Adaid. Pakuja related in detail how this man used to run after women at drinking festivals and seduce them in the darkness, instead of singing, dancing, and making merry with the other tribesmen. For this reason, many men were furious with him, but he did not worry about their threats. He also had relations with one of Vito's wives, and during a carousal he knocked challengingly on the door of Vito's hut with his espada. This sealed his fate. The chief went out with his bow and arrow to deal with the matter. The evildoer was alarmed and tried to run away, but Vito put 3 arrows into his back, and the Don Juan collapsed in a welter of blood. Then the other men came up. They had been wanting to settle accounts with the seducer for a long time. Now they poured arrows into him, and their heavy espadas smashed in his skull. At the wild howl of joy, the women came rushing up. They saw the dead man lying in his blood, and wept and scolded the men. They complained, so Pa Kaduja said, "Now they have killed our mate. Now we have no mate left." Here Pa Kaduja was interrupted. Conquad, the small son of the chief, had come up to us. He wanted to submit me to an important proceeding. While working, he had found a root, which he now chewed and then rubbed the brownish spittle over my arms, chest, and legs. "Now you will hunt many more monkeys," he assured me, and smeared some of the magic juice over his own body as well. The next day it was the women's turn to work. The men had gone hunting after they had first busily weeded Vito's old plantation, for a large quantity of yuccas were soon to be planted there. Now it was up to the women to do their share. Vito knew well that without his vigilant eye little useful work would be done, and so he had given up his pleasure in the chase and was giving directions to the host of naked women at work who hacked vigorously away with their bush knives at the brushwood and bushes. I stood beside Vito like an overseer, but the ladies would have none of that. Pano and Tessana, 2 high-spirited young women, seized me boldly by the arm, tapped my bush knife, and called on me to give a hand. "Toto, etsa, man va bolka," come on, clear the yucca field. But today it is the women's turn to work. I am no woman, I protested, and Vito laughed. "Narum," argued the women skillfully, "it's your yucca plantation after all." Resistance was useless. The party would not be satisfied until I had cleared a fair-sized patch of tough and prickly bush. They called the new field your yucca plantation, just as if it were going to belong to me, and that obviously gave them the right to order me about in an affectionate way and to work me hard. At midday we went to bathe in the stream and went back to the Maloka. Conquad fetched me to a meal. His aunt Tonga had roasted maize and groundnut for me. He said Tonga had noticed that roasted groundnuts with maize was one of my favorite dishes. In addition, she offered me a dish full of hairy caterpillars, which she had gathered in the woods and roasted into a tasty dish. I considered it advisable to cultivate this friendship a little. For recently the TUPARI seemed often to have overlooked the fact that I too had a stomach to fill. Here the attention of the cross-eyed Tonga stood me in very good stead. She behaved with modest reserve, and I was sure that she would not cause a scandal, as the reckless Adade had done. The women sang and danced on the square. The boys sat all round me and tried to find out all sorts of things. Would I marry Kabatoa, the chief's little daughter? They wanted to know. Vito himself had talked about it, they said. Did I want Tonga and Ade as well, one of the little fellows inquired. No, Ninkiabab, counseled another. It was really high time that Ninkiab, the graceful daughter of the neighboring chief, was married, and so 2, even 3 wives had been picked out for me, and it seemed an understood thing that I should be staying with the tribe for the rest of my days. The men were away hunting for several days. The women were not idle meanwhile. If towards noon the sun beat down too fiercely for them to go on working in the fields, then they busied themselves washing their husbands' hammocks. They had no soap. They boiled the dirty nets in their big stew pots, and then beat them down at the brook with heavy clubs and stones until the dirt came out. Torn hammocks were unpicked, the faulty strands freshly knotted, made up with newly spun thread and made into hammocks again. The women did not entirely neglect brewing chicha either. True, for the moment there was no fresh feast to be feared, but even on an ordinary working day, the TUPARI consider it beneath their dignity to drink water. Late in the night, the chief's wives and their daughters were still working at the chicha grinder. All around, my neighbors lay fast asleep. Then Tonga came and brought me a huge bowl full of fresh, warm chicha. The young woman looked all about her and nestled close to me. An Indian cleared his throat and leaned out of his hammock to fan to life his fire, which was going out. It had become noticeably chilly. "Haven't you any monkey meat left?" asked Tonga suddenly. I got up, reached up to the store shelf, and handed her half a leg of monkey. She smelt it, vanished in the darkness, and then joined her companions again, who were tirelessly turning the pestle and filling the large bellying pots with this beverage which was so indispensable. The large amount of work on his fields left the chief only little time for hunting, and so soon after my arrival he had gladly left it to me to provide his household with meat. Every few days I set off with my gun, accompanied first by one, then another of the tribesmen. I had gradually found out which men and boys made the best hunting companions, for by no means every Indian is a good hunter. Only about half of my TUPARI were able to hit with any certainty a spider monkey, a sapajou monkey, or an elector, and really bring it down. The other men, so Vito told me, did not bring a single monkey home from one year's end to the next, but at the most found a tortoise or an armadillo, which they smoked or dug out of its hole. Anyone who owned a good dog often caught an agouti or paca. More seldom still did the meat of crocodiles, deer, tajassau, or tapirs end up on the grill. One of the best hunters, and moreover an entertaining companion, was Pacaduja. We always came back laden with 2 or 3 monkeys. In addition, I learned something fresh every time about the habits of the principal animals which were hunted, where they used to hide from the hunters, and with what stratagems one could drive them from their hiding places and give chase. Pacaduja also knew how the other animals of the forest lived, and he tried to convince me of the truth of many a strange superstition. He maintained, for example, that a hunter was always obliged to sneeze whenever the women back at home were talking about him, and he firmly believed that one could not shoot an ape if a woman said, when one was leaving the Maloka, that one would not bag anything, or if one had sexual intercourse before going hunting. At this time, when enthusiasm for hunting was general, Pakaduja still offered to accompany me, but I preferred staying with Vito, for he used all leisure hours and the breaks for rest in the fields to tell me stories. As the weeks had passed, I had become more and more attached to him, and we gradually became clear in our own minds about the vocabulary which we possessed in common. Vito insisted on saying as much as possible in his scraps of Portuguese. The meaning of the words, however, he fixed on rather arbitrarily for the most part. To this was added his expressive sign language. Other things again he designated by their Indian names, which I had learnt in the meantime. It was astonishing how the chief's intelligence and good will almost made up for any deficiencies in the matter of language, at least all the while we were discussing everyday matters. Vito was pleased at the interest I showed in his tribe and in life in the jungle. Many a time when we sat in the evening outside the hut or by his fire, he told me how the Tupari had become acquainted with white men. It was a sad story. When I was still a child, we did not know that there, in the West, black and white men lived. Only we Tupari lived in this country, and round about were all the neighboring tribes. We were good friends with them all. Only with the wild Homno did our fathers have many a hard battle to fight. Among our best friends were numbered the Makarap, whom we call in our tongue Tomo. We often went to visit them, although the route is a hard one, for on the broad savannas the sun beats down upon your head all day long. The Makarap had a great chief and magician, Vaikuli, who has shot and poisoned many Makarap and Yabuti. Vaikuli was the father of Alfredo, who is now working in Salui. He was very fond of me and called me Akib, my little brother, and I called him Atsa, my big brother. One day we heard from our friends that strange foreign men had come up the river. The skin of some of them was white, and of others was black, and they did not go about naked like us, but wore trousers and shirts. They moved about on the river in big boats, driven by a monster which made a great noise. They did not hunt with bow and arrow, but fired with a tube from which small hard grains went into the animals' bodies with a big bang. These men spoke a language which no one understood. Soon they had advanced as far as the huts of the Makarap, but they were not bad men. They gave the Makarap many necklaces, mirrors, knives, and axes. Then they built their houses on the river bank, and looked for the trees which we call hurub, and from the sap of which we make balls for games. But the strangers did not make balls from the hurub sap, but big bales, and took them down the river in their boats. They also cut big clearings and planted much maize, bananas, mandioca, and also rice, and much else besides. They fetched the Makarap men, and gave them still more knives, and axes, and also shirts and trousers, hammocks, and mosquito nets. In return the Makarap had to help them fell trees and cut paths through the woods. We saw the axes and the knives which the Makarap had been given by the strangers. These axes were much harder than the stone axes with which we chopped wood, and they did not break. The strangers' knives, too, were much better than the bamboo knives and the blades of grass with which we cut meat and feathers for our arrows. We also wanted to have axes and knives like that, but we were afraid of the strangers. Our old men said that they were no human beings, but Tarupa, that is, the evil being, who brings diseases and kills men. So we called the strangers Tarupa, and even today we still give you that name, but we know that you are not that evil being, although you have brought us your diseases. When we first went home with news of these strangers, our women wept and said, "These Tarupa will come right to our huts and will kill us and our children." But soon we went and visited our Makarot friends again. They showed us even more gifts, which they had received from the strangers. We asked them for a few axes, and they gave us old, used axes, which they no longer needed, because they constantly received good, new tools from the whites. But we also saw that many Makarot were coughing and dying. It was the motors from the strangers' village which brought this cough up here. All the Makarot were coughing, and many, very many died. The Tarupa also went to the Yabuti, Veyoro, Arua, and Arakapu, and took them to work in their plantations and the rubber forest. They too received axes and knives, shirts and trousers, but they too began to cough, got headaches and fever, and very many of them died. Soon only a few were left alive. Finally the strangers came here too. 2 white men came to our Maloka. They were called Cravo and Evichi. Baipi, the Makurop chief, led them, and the Arakapu men carried their baggage. We had never yet seen a Tarupa, and were very frightened. We rushed outside the hut with bows and arrows, and our wives and children howled and hid in the hut or fled into the forest. But Baipi explained to us that the whites wanted to be our friends, and brought many gifts with them. The Tarupa distributed sugar and salt, and much else besides, and Baipi said we were to go with them and work in the Barakau. Then we would get axes and bush knives. I could not go with them because a little crocodile had bitten me in the arm. You can still see the scars here, but many men went with the Tarupa to do wood clearing for them. They had only been working a few days when a tree fell on a young white man and killed him. The Tupari were frightened and ran away. Many brought an axe home. They were the first good axes we had ever possessed. But when Cravo was with us, he coughed a great deal, and much slime came from his nose, and our men and women and many children began to cough too. Slime flowed from their noses, and they had bad pains in their head and chest. Many Tupari died. Many a chief and magician also died. So we were afraid, and did not want to go to the white men any longer, but we very much wanted to have more axes and knives. When I was married, and when my daughter May Roka was already born, another Tarupa came to us, the Toto Alamedo Mao. He came with many men from the tribes of the Yabuti, Veyoro, and Arakapu, and with 3 other Tarupa. One of them was a black man called Nicolau. The Toto Alemao brought many gifts, knives, axes, mirrors, combs, necklaces, and clothes, and other things besides. He was a very good man, and he was very tall, much taller than you and I and all of us. The black Nicolau laughed a great deal, and danced much with our wives, and he gave us many beads. But the Toto Alemnau was ill and coughed much. Our wives and children and men too began coughing again, and many died. When he went away again, we accompanied him to the huts of the white men, and worked there, and received still more axes and knives, and also shirts and trousers. Later we went to the whites again. Regino always gave us what we needed. He is a very good man. Rivoredo, too, is good. When my brother in Salawi got the cough and died, Rivoredo gave me a bush knife. Once a few women went with us to the whites, for there was no one there to make us chicha. 2 of them died of the cough. Now the women would no longer go to the Tarupa. Once Rivoredo took me and a few other men in the motor boat from Salawi to the big river. There we also saw a steamer with many Tarupa who looked at us for a long time and wanted to buy our bows and arrows. We built a big barakao and went back to Salawi. Many of us got a headache from the engine. The engine makes men sick and brings them the cough. And so, up to now, I have been 5 times to the Tarupa to get an axe or a knife. Once Regino came to us and took us off to work. The Black Pedro, too, once came with Severino when we were already living over here. They stayed here 3 days, but they would not help us to work. They were not good men. They took us to Salawi to work, and said we should get axes, knives, shirts, and trousers, but this was a lie. We worked, but we got no axes and knives. But many Tarupa had come, and they collected rubber. In the last rainy season, Toboro and his wife Maria and Rosa and Ricardo came. They sang much and danced, and also drank much chicha, and they did not cough. That was good. Toboro and Maria took many bows and arrows and hammocks away with them, and many other things, and gave us no axes or bush knives. That was not good. And now you have come, you too do not cough. That is good. You do much work, and hunt many apes, and are not wicked. You will stay here, and not go away again. There are only a few of us TUPARI left. All we have left are 2 houses, mine and Kwarume's. But we do much work, and have much maize and groundnuts, yams and yuccas for us and our wives and children, and we drink much chicha and sing and dance. That is good. Here, where we live now, not many people die any longer. The Tarupa may say that we should go to live in Salawi, but that is not good for us. We will stay here in these big houses. It is good to live. With the Tarupa, there are many diseases, and the rubber gatherers run after all the women. There is no good life there. We will only go to Salawi when we want more knives and axes. Then we will work for the Tarupa and come back home again to our Maloka. So it is good.